Welcome back into the Blacksburg Buzz. Today, we're finishing off the schedule deep dive. It's been a long time in the making, but it's part six. We're talking about VT versus Duke and UVA to conclude the season. Should be some pretty tough games for the Hokies, in all honesty. Two pretty decent teams in the ACC. Duke probably a little bit better than UVA, sitting around, I'd have them 6 to 8 in the conference, and UVA just a little bit lower than that, but still could be some tough games on the horizon. Now, before we break down these two games and what I'm expecting, let's talk about our video sponsor, Bet Online. Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football. Bet Online has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads to bet on during the games. Think you know your stuff? Get in on our $200,000 mega contest and pick 5 games against the spread every week for your chance at weekly prizes and a share of 200K. When the game's over, head on over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of our over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Bet online, the game starts here. So, with Duke being the second to last regular season game for the Hokies, they're a pretty solid ACC team. They've been performing well this year, 5-1 record through 6 weeks of play. They were 8-5 last season. They had big wins over Clemson, Northwestern, NC State, and Troy in the Birmingham Bowl. So, especially that Clemson win, that is a good win for this Duke team. The only bad loss that they really had was to UVA last year. But wow, they had a tough schedule with 5 ranked teams on it. They had 2 teams in the top 10. They had Notre Dame at 11, Louisville at 18, and UNC at 24. That's a pretty tough schedule, and somehow they still went 8-5. A good team overall. With that 5-1 record this season, their only loss is to Georgia Tech. Duke was basically immobilized on the ground, only 85 rushing yards for the team in that game, less than 300 yards of total offense against Georgia Tech, 5 punts, a turnover on down, 2 touchdowns, a missed field goal, and an interception. A pretty rough game against the Yellow Jackets for the Blue Devils. But other than that, they've been doing pretty well and just cruising. They do have a few tough games left. There's SMU and Miami on the schedule, but I think they take out FSU, NC State, and Wake Forest that are also coming up. So they're going to finish pretty solid in the ACC this year, I believe. I don't see them as necessarily an ACC championship game contender, but I think they're going to be a good overall team and finish with a really solid overall record within the conference. A few players to watch. You've got Malik Murphy, the quarterback, 60% completion rate, 14 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, and 238 yards per game. Now, Murphy isn't a guy you can rely on the ground. You don't want him running the ball. Minus 54 yards on the season from 9 attempts. That's pretty rough out of Murphy. So if you keep him contained in the pocket and you can break through, get some guys like APR and Peebles through the line, Murphy's going to have a tough day for the Blue Devils. And you've got the running back, Star Thomas, a huge workload compared to the other backs. 113 attempts, 528 yards total this season, about 88 yards per game. He doesn't score a ton, only 3 touchdowns this year, but close to 5 yards per carry. He's a pretty efficient back that will have to be watched. There's also Jordan Moore, the wide receiver, 30 catches for 443 yards. He leads the receivers in that department. 3 touchdowns, averaging just shy of 15 yards per reception. That's a huge number. That's very impressive if he can sustain that. 15 is ridiculous. Behind Jordan Moore, I believe it's Eli Pancole, another wide receiver, 23 catches for 294 yards, 5 touchdowns, and just shy of 13 yards per reception. There's also Samir Hagens, 16 catches for 179 yards, 1 touchdown, and just over 11 yards per reception. These three guys are dominating the receiving game for the Blue Devils. Moore is really your high volume, high efficiency guy, but Pankola is doing it very well too. And Hagens doesn't have shabby numbers either. Three guys you're going to have to be aware of on the field, but Moore is really the guy that demands the most amount of attention just with the sheer yardage, the sheer explosiveness, and, just frankly having more catches. Although Pancol is the guy that's getting in the end zone the most out of the three of them. There's also Nicky Dalmelin, a tight end for the Blue Devils, 11 catches for 167 yards. So pretty good stuff there from him as well. 2 touchdowns, 15.2 yards per reception. So a lot of different receiving threats here for Duke, and they're going to be mixing it up quite a bit. With this Duke team, they've got a pretty stifling defense, in all honesty. 4 interceptions and 5 forced fumbles. They only allow 17.5 points per game so far this season. That's pretty impressive through 6 games, being sub 20 points per game. There are only 4 games on the schedule with opponents over 20 points, and one of them went into double overtime. So I don't really know if that one should count as being a plus 20-point game. I mean, there was more than 20 points, but double overtime should definitely put an asterisk on that one. Pretty solid stuff from the Blue Devils for a team who doesn't have one of their ACC stars, Aeneas Peebles, anymore, who now plays for the Hokies. Duke is a good team. Like I said earlier, I think they're around 6 to 8 in my ACC rankings. I've definitely got them behind teams like Clemson, Miami, SMU, Louisville, and Pitt. All teams who are or were just recently ranked. Louisville just fell out of the rankings, but Miami, Clemson, SMU, and Pitt are all currently ranked teams. And I've got Duke not too far behind those five, maybe one or two other teams mixed in ahead of them. This will be a reasonably tough game for Virginia Tech, but they've got a lot of time to prepare for it as well. There's a week off after the Clemson game on the 9th. Now, if it wasn't for Vanderbilt to start the year, I would say Virginia Tech can take down any team that they had on the schedule with 14 days to prep for. Now, we all know how Vanderbilt went. If you saw that game, didn't exactly look like an offseason of prep went into it, but this team has started to turn things around. Virginia Tech's playing a lot better. They dominated Stanford. They played a really tight game and nearly had the win against Miami. This is going to be a tough game against Duke, but I'm giving Virginia Tech the edge in this one. A bit concerning, but I think the Hokies are going to be 5-5 headed into this game, and I think they leave Durham 6-5, just a little bit over 500. I got losses to Syracuse and Clemson coming up on Virginia Tech's schedule in my book. Now, I do think they could beat Syracuse. Clemson, a little bit of a different story, just a different level of team, but there's certainly upset potential in both of those games. Now, after Duke, Virginia Tech heads back home for another edition of the Commonwealth Clash, facing off against UVA in Lane Stadium. It's been a little while since the Hokies have played the Cavaliers at Lane, and UVA is a shockingly good team this year, if I'm being truly honest, at least in terms of their record. 4-1 ain't that bad. They beat Richmond, Wake Forest, Coastal Carolina, and Boston College. Lost to Maryland 13-27, but they have an insanely hard schedule coming up. You've got Louisville, who just fell out of the rankings, but they were ranked for a while. You got number 10 Clemson on the schedule, number 22 Pitt, number 11 Notre Dame, and number 25 SMU, who just beat Louisville and entered the rankings just yesterday. Four ranked teams, and Louisville was ranked last week too. This is a crazy tough schedule coming up from the Cavaliers. They're not a terrible team by any means, but oh my goodness, I only expect them to maybe be favored for one game the rest of the season, and that's against UNC. They honestly just have a really tough ACC schedule, not much of a break there. You might have thought maybe this wasn't the worst schedule before the season with how things were projected in the offseason in the ACC. But, with FSU falling off so bad, SMU living up to the hype, Pitt's having a good season. I mean, this is a brutal schedule for UVA. They're going to have a really tough time getting to 6-6 by the end of the season. Not by their own fault. It's just their schedule coming up is that difficult. Frankly, last season, UVA was bad. 3-9. They had one bright spot, and that's beating UNC, who's ranked number 10 at the time. Now, I don't want to take away from that win. That is a huge win. Being a currently one-win team who'd only beat William and Mary that season and being the number 10 team ranked in the country is huge. But that was only their second win of the year. And then they beat Duke later in the season by 3 as well, which I mentioned earlier. But other than that, no wins to be found. Just a brutal year. And then, speaking of brutal, talk about last year's Commonwealth Clash. That did not go in the Cavaliers' favor at all. 17-55 loss at home. The Hokies had next to no opposition in Charlottesville. You had touchdowns from Felton, who had two, Stephen Gosnell, Bashal Tootin, Tucker Holloway, and Malachi Thomas. Just crazy game all around from Virginia Tech's production. And UVA couldn't muster any offense. They didn't even score until the third quarter. It was not the prettiest game for the Cavaliers. But this team has already surpassed their win total from last year. They look like a much improved team. So we'll see how that shakes out with such a tough schedule coming up. Now, players to watch for this team, of course, Anthony Calandria, the quarterback. He's 99 for 149 in his attempts this season. That's about 66% completion rate, 8 touchdowns to 4 interceptions so far, and 24 yards per game. Calandria is also good with his legs. Net positive 158 yards on the ground from him, although Virginia Tech has been much better with mobile quarterbacks in the last few games. Along with Calandria in the offense, you've got Xavier Brown, the running back, 38 rushes for 315 yards. Brown is the most efficient back on the team. 8.3 yards per carry is pretty nasty. I'm curious to see how his efficiency is or isn't affected in the next few weeks with so many tough opponents on the schedule. But so far through the first several games, Brown is just eating teams up on the ground. There's also Kobe Pace, another running back. He's had the most opportunities this year with 61, but he's much less efficient than Brown has been. Now, not to take anything away from Pace, 4.8 yards per carry is not bad at all, but it's no 8.3. But Pace also has 2 touchdowns compared to Brown's 0. So you've got to balance those out. Probably 2 different backs we're getting here, but they've been pretty effective against every team that the Cavaliers have played so far. Then, when you look at the wide receivers, Malachi Fields, by far the most involved receiver in this Cavaliers offense. Fields has pretty close to 1/3 of the total receptions for UVA this season. 28 of the 103 total, 412 yards, 3 touchdowns, nearly a 15-yard average. Fields is a beast when Calandria gets him the ball. He's had great production so far, and he'll look to continue that. A tough group of corners for the Hokies, but Fields had a decent day, all things considered, in the last Commonwealth Clash. I believe he was pretty involved if I remember correctly, UVA just couldn't string anything together and punch it in. Then another wide receiver, Trell Harris. He's only played 3 games so far, but 13 catches for 201 yards isn't bad at all. 15.5 yards per catch. There's also Tyler Neville, the tight end, 12 catches, 197 yards. 16.4 yards per catch is pretty filthy, too. UVA has just been dominating teams this season. Pretty good stats all around from the crew. Now, some notes on this team. The schedule has been pretty easy, but at the same time, I would say whose schedule isn't easy before conference play? That's kind of the whole point, really, of a lot of power conference teams. You rack up a couple easy wins, some fun games, maybe, but that's typically what a lot of teams do. At the end of the day, UVA scheduled these games and they're winning them. So you can't really say all that much about it. We'll know how legit UVA is in probably the next 2 weeks against two great ACC schools. But at this point, they're winning most of their games. And honestly, you can't knock them for winning the games on their schedule. You just can't do that. The scary thing for UVA is that other than UNC, they legitimately don't have many good matchups left. Now, there's always potential for an upset, and we know that all too well from this last week. I mean, you've got Vanderbilt upsetting number 1 Alabama. Like that was insane. Mizzou lost to Texas A&M. Miami almost lost to Cal. A ton of upsets in the last week, and we know that it's always possible. But I'm sure that the Cavaliers would like to see 1 or 2 more easy-ish games on the schedule. It's gonna be a tough road ahead of them, depending on how they're able to play. Now, looking at this Commonwealth Clash matchup, the Hokies haven't lost to UVA since 2019, and before that, 2003. That's only 2 losses since I was born in 2001. I'm currently a first year master's student at Virginia Tech, so it's been a pretty hard road as of recent for the Cavaliers, at least in the Commonwealth Clash. UVA, yes, they're better than they were last year, but I just can't imagine they win this game. You've got the Commonwealth Clash in Lane Stadium, the first time with fans since 2018. There's no way. I've got Hokies all the way in this one. No doubt about it, if you ask me. With where the Hokies currently sit at 3-3 and my predictions for the rest of the season, I have Tech closing out their year 7-5 with additional losses coming up to Syracuse and Clemson. I think 8-4 is in the picture, but Syracuse is probably the more likely team you get that 8th win against, and they're still going to be a tough team, particularly on the road, which is why I'm leaning towards 7-5. Definitely below what I and many others thought in the offseason, and I don't think Hokie fans should be happy with 7-5, but that's just frankly where I think the cards are going to fall this season. It's really hard to do all too much better than that. And I really just need to see another week or two of consistent improvements before I'm comfortable flipping my pick against the Orange. The Hokies have made consistent improvements for the last probably 2 weeks, but I need to see a little bit more before I'm comfortable saying they go on the road and beat Syracuse and potentially finish out 8-4. They've still got a tough road ahead of them. 8-4 isn't a bad season, but you would have hoped for a little bit better with just the projections, the hype, the media attention during the offseason. But all in all, I think Virginia Tech finishes out the year on a high note, beats UVA in the Commonwealth Clash in Lane Stadium for the first time since 2018 in front of some fans.